Big Shaq thought he was just catching a flight, until he watched a black man get erased in plain sight. Devon Rucker wasn't loud. He wasn't dangerous. He was just next. No headlines. No resistance. Just a boarding pass quietly voided, and a presence deleted. But this time, someone was watching. Someone who doesn't look away. What started at Gate 22 will echo through boardrooms, broadcast booths, and the entire country. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport hummed like a living organism. Bright, pulsing, alive with people moving in every direction. Morning sunlight streamed through massive glass panes, casting streaks of golden light across polished floors that reflected the day's promise. It was one of those days where everything looked too perfect to question, where you almost forget the weight of the world beyond the terminal gates. But not Big Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq to millions. Shaq to friends and strangers alike. Moved through the terminal like a mountain gliding on rhythm. No security entourage, no sunglasses to hide behind. Just him, head held high, a duffel over his shoulder, and a quiet smile that had the power to disarm even the most hardened TSA agent. He didn't walk like a celebrity. He walked like someone who'd seen life from both ends of the rope, and chose to carry it instead of cut it. Travelers spotted him and smiled. Some whispered. A few approached with nervous excitement. He gave them all his warmth, posed for a selfie with a teen in a wheelchair, shared a quick laugh with an elderly couple on their way to New Jersey, and gave a small high five to a boy who nearly dropped his juice box in awe. It wasn't performance. It was just Shaq. Presence was his currency, and today he was spending it freely. He had just come back from Detroit, where he'd hosted a youth basketball fundraiser in a neighborhood where hoop dreams were more than metaphors. He was running on little sleep, had nothing to promote, no press to do, and yet he moved like he was exactly where he needed to be. And yet as he made his way past Gate 14, he noticed something odd. Not loud, not dramatic, just off. It was the way a TSA agent stood stiffly by a wall, eyes darting but saying nothing. The way a family at the corner table hushed their conversation, eyes tracking something, or someone across the hall. The way two flight attendants exchanged clipped words, glancing toward Gate 22 with a tension that didn't match the ease of the morning. Shaq had learned long ago that silence in public spaces was often louder than noise. He didn't stop walking, but his focus sharpened. Something subtle was brewing. Gate 22 was unusually quiet for a flight about to board. No boarding calls, no welcome announcements, just a line of passengers frozen in place, their expressions muted and confused. It was like a scene paused mid-frame. At the center of that frame stood a black man in a charcoal suit, his carry-on resting by his feet, passport still in hand. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't moving. But something about him didn't sit right with the staff. Or maybe it was the other way around. Shaq tilted his head slightly as he passed, slowing just enough to observe without drawing attention. The man, mid to late 30s, well-groomed, confident posture but visibly restrained, was speaking to an airport worker whose expression carried the discomfort of someone performing a task they weren't entirely comfortable with, but determined to finish anyway. Shaq picked up phrases as he walked: routine screening, delayed processing, boarding adjustment. There was no raised voice, no aggression, but the tension was thick, so thick that it traveled in silence from one end of the gate to the other. The man's body language wasn't combative, just confused. There was a clarity in his eyes, the kind of clarity that comes not from surprise but from recognition. He'd seen this before, maybe not here, but somewhere, maybe everywhere. Shaq didn't stop. Not yet. This wasn't his moment. Not unless it became one. He respected spaces, even the ones that didn't always respect people like him. But his pace slowed, and his internal sensors kicked on, the kind of awareness he'd honed over decades on and off the court. This wasn't about a missed flight. This was about something else. He moved past the gate and found a seat with a clean view. Not too close, just near enough to keep the scene in his peripheral. He checked his phone messages from his assistant, a few social media mentions, one from a local nonprofit in Houston thanking him for a donation he hadn't made public. He replied quietly, then put the phone face down. A child nearby giggled at a cartoon playing on a tablet. The smell of strong coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. An announcement buzzed over the speakers about a gate change in Concourse C. Life continued as if nothing was wrong. That was the part that dug deepest. How normal everything looked while something wrong was unraveling just a few feet away. Shaq folded his arms and leaned back slightly, observing, processing. There was a time, years ago, when he might have assumed it was a misunderstanding, might have told himself the staff were just doing their job, that these things happened, that it wasn't always about race. But that was before he'd seen too many Devons, too many quiet removals, too many moments swept under polished airport floors. Now he noticed the details. The way the man had his credentials ready before being asked. The way no other passenger was flagged. The way the white man behind him, equally dressed, equally alone, was waved through without question. The subtle things that didn't scream injustice but whispered it over and over again. He noticed the staff, not cruel, just cold, detached, following a script written in invisible ink. The kind you couldn't trace, only feel. Shaq's breath slowed. His hands rested easy, but his heart started to pound, not out of anger but awareness. This was one of those moments. The kind you didn't expect, but you'd better be ready for. The kind that decided what kind of person you were, not when the cameras were on, but when no one expected you to care. He glanced around. The man still stood at the gate, still waiting, still being delayed. The other passengers began murmuring now. Confusion grew. One man shook his head and walked away, muttering about security theater, but most just watched, then looked away. Shaq didn't. He sat still, still as stone, watching with the patience of someone who knew the story wasn't over yet. It hadn't even started. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered his mother's words. Sometimes the loudest noise is when nobody says a word.
That was today.
And this was only the beginning. Shaq shifted his position in the waiting area, leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, his massive hands folded as he studied the unfolding tension like a coach watching the early minutes of a game. Silent, unreadable, but entirely alert. From a distance, nothing screamed conflict. There were no raised voices, no security sprinting across terminals, no dramatic confrontation to draw a crowd. And yet, the air around Gate 22 had shifted into something unmistakably uneasy. The man at the center of it all was composed, poised even, standing like he'd spent years perfecting the art of staying calm under scrutiny. Late 30s, dressed in a slate-gray business suit, clean-shaven, neatly braided hair pulled back, a leather laptop bag strapped across his shoulder. Every inch of him suggested success, preparation, control. But his eyes told a different story. They didn't scream. They questioned. They asked the same question over and over. Why me? Again. Two airline staff members stood in front of him. One male, one female. Their posture was procedural, like they'd rehearsed this before, but without the grace of someone who believed in what they were doing. The woman kept glancing at the man's boarding pass like it might change under pressure. The man avoided direct eye contact altogether, editing to official-sounding phrases, delivered with a monotone that could easily be mistaken for indifference. Passengers nearby watched in fits and starts, curious, cautious, complicit. A mother holding her toddler glanced once, frowned, and turned away. A college-aged man with earbuds briefly paused his music, tilted his head, then shrugged and returned to scrolling his phone. Most did what they were trained by society to do. Nothing. Shaq didn't move. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to not intervene too soon. This wasn't about stepping in and demanding justice like some headline hero. It was about seeing the whole play first, understanding the terrain, before you made your move. The suited man had been quietly taken aside under the pretense of random screening. Not forcibly, not publicly enough to cause alarm, but with just enough pressure to make it clear that compliance was expected, and resistance would not end well. He was being asked to wait, not because he had done anything wrong, but because someone somewhere had clicked the wrong box on a screen, or maybe because no one needed to click anything at all. Shaq recognized the pattern instantly. He'd seen it in hotels, in restaurants, in upscale boutiques, in boardrooms dressed up as progressive spaces. The script was always the same. Sir, it's just a routine check. We appreciate your cooperation. This won't take long, but it always took something: dignity, time, presence. And it always gave something too, a quiet gnawing reminder that your place could still be questioned, no matter how polished your shoes or how impressive your resume. One of the agents, mid-30s, brown hair, tight jaw, spoke into a shoulder mic, his eyes glancing around the room like a rookie cop trying to stay calm under pressure. Shaq followed the glance. There were no senior staff in sight, no supervisors stepping in to de-escalate. Just the man, the agents, and the invisible wall they were building brick by brick, word by word. Shaq leaned back slightly. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just jeans, a black hoodie, a pair of Nikes, but he was unmistakable. He'd felt the stares shift his way the moment he sat down. Yet no one came over now. They were watching him watch, curious maybe, waiting to see what he'd do. That was the thing about being Big Shaq. People expected him to do something, but sometimes restraint was the more strategic response. The man being questioned, Shaq would learn his name later, didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for help, didn't argue. That's what struck Shaq the hardest. The absence of resistance. The presence of familiarity. Like the man had been here before, not this airport, not this exact gate, but this exact experience. It didn't shake him. It just wore him down. Shaq stood up, casually, stretching his arms, and walking slowly toward a vending machine that happened to offer a full view of the gate. He didn't approach the agents, didn't make eye contact with the man. He just stood there, larger than life, pretending to consider between trail mix and peanut M&Ms, but every part of him was listening. He caught a fragment of conversation. Not matching our internal verification. Just a precaution, sir. You'll be rebooked on a later flight. Rebooked. Without cause. Without explanation. Just like that. Shaq selected a bottle of water, slid in a bill, and waited for the clunk of the drop. When it came, it was louder than expected, like the moment itself demanded attention. The agents paused, only for a second, realizing they were being watched, not just by Shaq, but by others now too. The ripple had begun. Shaq returned to his seat, this time closer to the gate, not close enough to intervene, but close enough to cast a shadow. He cracked open the water and took a slow sip, never breaking his line of sight. The suited man was no longer holding his boarding pass. One of the agents had taken it. Another agent, different uniform, possibly security, had now joined the scene. More words were exchanged, quieter this time. The man checked his watch. His eyes flicked to the screen above the gate. His flight was still listed as on time, but he wasn't boarding. Instead, the agent stepped aside and began typing into a handheld device. The man's name was now in a system, one that wasn't open to him, one that would travel ahead of him, whispering things he'd never be allowed to hear. Shaq closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. Still no yelling. Still no violence. But the injustice was loud now, thudding in his chest. He thought about what it would cost to walk up and say something. He thought about what it would mean to that man, to the people watching, to the people recording on their phones, but not sharing. He also thought about how easy it would be for the staff to spin it later. Shaquille O'Neal interferes with airport security. That's how these things went viral in the wrong direction. So he waited. Because sometimes exposing a system required more than just noise. It required evidence. Truth not shouted, but undeniable. Then, something shifted. A young black employee, likely airport maintenance, walked past pushing a cleaning cart. As he passed the gate, he slowed just enough to make brief eye contact with Shaq. Then at the suited man, the connection was fleeting, but it said everything. The employee gave a slow nod, almost imperceptible, then kept walking. Shaq clocked it. There were others watching. Others who knew. Others who were just as tired. Back at the gate, the staff returned the man's documents. But it was too late. His original flight had closed. Boarding was complete. And just like that, he had been removed without being removed. Quietly erased. No one clapped. No one screamed. The plane took off. The man sat down in a chair near the window, silent. He didn't look angry. He looked empty. Shaq stood again, walked past him slowly. As he passed, he gently dropped a small folded paper from his back pocket onto the man's duffel bag. On it was a number. A contact. Not for show, for support. The man didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew. Shaq walked on, deeper into the terminal, jaw tight, heart heavy. He didn't know the man's name yet, but he knew the story, knew it because he'd lived parts of it, knew it because millions had, and because for every person who stood up in the moment, 10 more didn't, not out of fear, out of exhaustion. But this time Shaq wasn't walking away. Not really. He was just circling back a different way, a quieter way, a way that would let the whole truth rise without getting buried in noise. Something had to give. And today, the system had taken one more name, But tomorrow? Tomorrow, it would give one back. Shaq sat across from a coffee kiosk tucked near the edge of the concourse, a vantage point where he could still see Gate 22 in partial view. The suited man, now grounded, remained seated in a corner chair, posture straight but spirit sunken, in a way only someone who'd been quietly dismissed could understand. There was no scene, no spectacle, just a man stripped of mobility without explanation, stuck in the stillness left behind by a departing plane. That plane had taken off minutes ago, but it had taken more than luggage with it. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on the table, as the name finally floated into his awareness, from a snippet of conversation between the staff at the gate and the uniformed airport personnel, now casually debriefing near the exit. Devin Rucker. It landed with weight in Shaq's mind, not because it was famous or familiar, but because it had already been buried, reduced to a file, a warning, a delay code. The way the staff member said it was mechanical, like a call number on a waiting list, not a name belonging to a man who had just lost his right to proceed. Shaq repeated it under his breath once, just to let it sit. Devin Rucker. He pulled out his phone, not to film, not to rant, but to look. Within moments he had found him. Devin A. Rucker. 38 years old. Senior software engineer. Atlanta base. A few archived conference presentations. A LinkedIn profile that read like a success story. Full scholarship. Early graduation. Patents in development. A recent invitation to speak at a tech symposium in San Diego. The flight he had just missed. No red flags. No threats. No criminal record. No random triggers that would justify a security detainment, let alone a full boarding cancellation. There was no mistake here. Just misplacement. A man placed in a category with no form, no face, no fair reason. Shaq's hand hovered over his phone's screen, debating whether to screenshot the information, not for exposure, not yet, but to hold the truth before it slipped back into obscurity. Then he noticed a quiet notification, a message from someone he hadn't heard from in a while. Langston Ted. Langston wasn't just an old acquaintance. He was a man who'd worked the underbelly of the air travel industry for years, now in aviation data compliance. Not someone who made noise, just someone who saw it all. His message was short, direct. I saw what happened. It wasn't random. Shaq's grip tightened slightly on the phone. He looked up again. Devin hadn't moved. His phone was out, but he wasn't scrolling. His eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on a spot near the gate, staring through the wall like he was watching the version of himself who had boarded the flight he was supposed to take. A version who didn't get flagged, who didn't get categorized, who didn't have to sit in quiet erasure. The security staff had long since left. The airline agents had rotated out. The new group seemed unaware, or perhaps just unconcerned with the incident that had unfolded only moments before. That was how it worked. The system was designed for erasure, for speed, for moving on. But Shaq couldn't. He stood up, walked across the floor with casual steps, and chose the seat next to Devin without saying a word. He didn't speak, didn't need to, just sat, letting his presence do the work. Devin eventually turned slightly, gave a tight smile, and nodded. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not just of who Shaq was, but of what his sitting beside him meant. Devin broke the silence first, voice quiet, eyes still distant. I didn't even ask why. What would have been the point? Shaq didn't answer, just let the words float between them. There was nothing to dispute, no correction to offer. The truth was self-evident. Devin exhaled slowly and leaned back in the seat, his hands on his knees. San Diego. Tech thing. I was speaking on bias in machine learning. He chuckled once, low and bitter. Guess I didn't need to go far to find a case study. Shaq studied him carefully, not just his words but his weariness. The kind that didn't come from one bad morning but from a lifetime of them. The kind of weariness that hardens into survival. That teaches you not to shout, not to fight, because the cost of being loud is often paid in silence later. Boarding pass disappeared. Devin continued. 1 minute I'm cleared. Next minute, it's gone. They didn't scan it. They erased it. Like I was never scheduled. That detail stuck. Not just denied boarding. Voided. Wiped clean. Shaq asked. Finally, do you want this to be public? Devin hesitated. I don't know what I want. I'm not new to this. But this time felt different. Like they didn't even care about the optics anymore. Shaq nodded, understanding. There was a difference between being wronged and being erased. One you could fight, the other left you no target. Devon stood up and adjusted his bag, preparing to leave. I don't want to be a hashtag, he said flatly. I just wanted to give a damn talk. Shaq reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a card, not a business card, not flashy, just a handwritten number and a name. A contact. A door. Take this, he said. You don't have to decide anything now. But if you ever want someone to listen, really listen, it's yours. Devon looked at the card for a long second before tucking it into his bag without a word. Then he nodded, not a goodbye, not gratitude. Just a silent contract between two people who understood too much too well. As Devon walked away, Shaq felt the weight shift inside him. It wasn't rage. Rage was easy. This was heavier. This was the realization that systems didn't have to be loud to be dangerous. They could smile, offer free drinks, and still rob you blind. He pulled his phone back out and tapped Langston's message. Not random? Tell me more. The reply came fast. Internal memo. Passenger flag based on behavioral profiles. You already know what that means. I'll send what I can. Behavioral profiles. The term sounded sterile, scientific, but Shaq knew better. It was a digital cousin of the same invisible bias that had stopped Devon, paused his day, rewrote his narrative without ink. He wasn't flagged for what he did. He was flagged for who he could be in someone's flawed projection. Shaq opened a note on his phone and typed 4 words. Devon Rucker was erased. He stared at the sentence for a long moment, then closed the app. A few feet away, a new set of passengers lined up at gate 22, chatting, sipping overpriced coffee, eyes on their phones. The gate had moved on. The staff had changed shifts. The system had refreshed. But Shaq hadn't. He walked toward the terminal exit slowly, the sounds of the airport swelling around him, but none of it could drown out what he now carried. He knew a name, a real one, and names had power, if you didn't let them disappear. The corridor leading past the airport operations office was quiet, hushed in a way that almost seemed sacred. It was a place most travelers never saw, a narrow space sandwiched between function and control, where the airport's heartbeat hummed in wires, data streams, and cold LED monitors. Shaq had been in countless buildings like this, in back rooms where the public face of an institution gave way to its internal wiring. And he knew something the public rarely did. The most dangerous places weren't where chaos lived, but where silence went unquestioned. He hadn't planned to dig deeper. Not this fast. But after Devon's erasure, and after Langston's cryptic message about profiling protocols, a switch had flipped. It wasn't outrage that moved Shaq now. It was calculation. If you wanted to uncover the quiet systemic mechanisms that erased people like Devon without fanfare, you couldn't confront them head-on. You had to see them, and not as they wanted to be seen, but as they truly operated. He approached the administrative check-in near Terminal B with a warm demeanor, offering the kind of disarming smile that said, "Hey, I've just got a quick favor to ask." The man behind the counter, early 40s, red tie, sharp haircut, blinked twice before realizing who stood in front of him. Mr. O'Neill. Wow. Welcome, sir. Shaq gave him a nod. Appreciate it, man. Just passing through, but I had a question. The man straightened slightly. Of course. Anything we can help with. Shaq leaned on the counter. Voice casual. Tone light. Was sitting near gate 22 earlier. Noticed something odd with one of the passengers being rerouted. Made me curious how security screening decisions are handled. Thought maybe I could take a quick peek at how the review process works, just to learn. There was a flicker of hesitation in the man's eyes. Then a shift. Shaq knew what he was doing. He wasn't threatening, wasn't accusing. He was requesting, with just enough curiosity to mask intent. Celebrities had that kind of access. It could open doors that stayed locked. He hated leveraging it, but today, it wasn't for him. The man made a call, brief and muted. Within minutes, Shaq was escorted down a secure hallway by a compliance officer named Dorrell. A tall, lean man, with a clipboard and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We appreciate your interest," Dorrell said, unlocking a side door with a keycard. "Always happy to share how we keep our operations smooth." Inside, the room was cold with air conditioning and bathed in blue light. Wall-mounted monitors displayed rotating surveillance feeds. Some live, some archived. People came and went on screen, tiny and unknowing, like pieces on a board being shuffled between gates, lounges, terminals. Shaq looked at the array, letting it all sink in. Dozens of screens, hundreds of eyes, but none of them pointed where they were most needed. Doril gestured to a terminal. This is one of the review stations. If you're curious about a specific window of time, we can pull it. Shaq nodded. Gate 22, around 9:50 a.m. Just want to see the rerouting protocol. Dorel tapped in a command. The monitor blinked, then loaded a split-screen view. One angle from above the boarding area, one directly from the gate desk. Timestamps flickered in the corners. Shaq's eyes locked in immediately. There was Devon, arriving early. Calm, standing in line. Shaq recognized every movement. Devon adjusting his cufflinks. Devon shifting his weight. Devon reaching for his ID without being prompted. All signs of someone used to preempting discomfort. The footage rolled forward. Then came the moment. One of the agents tapped a small device on the desk. A light blinked red. Devon's information popped up on the corner screen. Dorel paused the frame. Shaq leaned closer. What's that overlay? System flag, Dorel replied. It doesn't indicate a criminal alert. Just internal protocol triggers. Shaq didn't move. Triggers based on what? Dorel hesitated. Behavioral analytics, mostly. Movement patterns, flight history, data correlations. Shaq stared at the screen. Correlations with what? Again Dorel hesitated. Statistical profiling. It's complicated. Shaq leaned back slightly. His face was calm, but inside, the shape of something darker was taking form. Devon hadn't done anything. He had simply existed in a way that the system didn't like. And that system had enough power to quietly decide his presence was optional. Shaq tapped the desk gently. Can we go back further? Not just Devon. I want to see the last week at that gate. Just the people flagged. Dorel blinked. That's a lot of data. I'll wait, Shaq said simply. The compliance officer's fingers moved reluctantly. The screen flickered again, this time pulling time-stamped footage into a mosaic grid. Shaq watched. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, each time, a new face flagged. Not all black, but most. Brown too. A woman in a hijab. A young Latino man in a hoodie. None of them escalated. None of them caused a scene. All of them were pulled aside. Quietly, casually, efficiently. The pattern was no longer anecdotal. It was structural. Shaq's hands tightened slightly on the chair's arms. Do these people know they've been flagged? Not exactly, Dorel admitted. It's presented as routine. Shaq gave him a long look. So the routine is built on making people invisible. Dorel didn't answer. The monitors rolled on, each feed a quiet betrayal of the promises airports made. Safety, fairness, equality. Shaq saw it now not as a string of unfortunate incidents, but as a blueprint. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it had been designed to. Quietly profile, silently adjust, systematically erase. He stood, the chair creaking under his weight. I appreciate the tour, he said evenly. Dorel nodded, relieved. Shaq walked out of the room, each step heavier than the last. The air outside the surveillance hub felt thicker, laced with the knowledge he could no longer ignore. He had seen behind the glass, and what stared back wasn't a mistake. It was intent. As he exited into the sunlight-streaked hallway, his phone buzzed. Another message from Langston. Check your email. Forward you something internal. You'll understand the scope. Shaq opened the file. It was a policy memo. Confidential, titled Passenger Risk Indicators, and Response Flowchart. Underlined were categories that included not just behavior but visual markers and nonverbal cues. There were internal tags. RBP3, RBP4. Shaq scrolled to the glossary. RBP4, repeat black passenger. No aggressive history. Travels solo. Suits hard shoes. Strong eye contact. Quiet demeanor. It hit like a punch. Devon's profile laid out like a warning. Shaq shut the phone off and stood still, heart thudding. No threat. No crime. Just presence being coded as suspicion. He moved through the airport with a different gait now, not the relaxed rhythm from earlier, but the slow, firm stride of someone assembling truth piece by piece. Outside, the sun blazed across the tarmac, planes taking off like clockwork. Passengers moved, unaware. The glass walls gleamed in architectural perfection. But inside, behind those panes, behind those systems, something rotten festered quietly. Shaq no longer saw this as an isolated incident. He saw it for what it was, A network of decisions made behind doors, presented in politeness, enforced in silence. And now, he had seen it. And he wouldn't let it hide again. The evening shadows inside the terminal had grown longer, stretching over tile and glass like silent fingers tracing the edges of the day. Shaq lingered near the window by a row of vending machines, away from the swirl of boarding calls and departure screens. He was still, but his mind moved like a metronome, caught in the rhythm of everything he had just seen. The footage, the profiling tags, the erasure carried out in algorithmic whispers. It had all formed a shape now, not just of injustice, but of design. He had seen systems fail before, but this wasn't failure. This was intent, smoothed over with customer service smiles and buried under technical language that almost dared you to call it what it was. The world bustled on behind him. Flight announcements, beeping carts, the soft squeak of wheels on tile. And then came a sound that didn't match the usual tempo. A soft hum, a slow drag of a mop. Shaq turned slightly and saw him. The janitor, older man, gray around the temples, eyes that held more miles than maps. Uniform clean but faded, posture tired but unbowed. He moved with the kind of patience that came from knowing the world rarely moved with you. Shaq had noticed him earlier in the day, quiet, deliberate, invisible to most. But now the man paused beside him. "Long day?" he asked, voice gravel soft. Shaq offered a nod. "Long enough." The janitor leaned his mop against the wall, wiped his hands on a rag, then pulled something small from his front pocket. It was a plain black flash drive. No labels, no logos, just weight. He handed it to Shaq without ceremony. "Watch it," he said, "when you're alone." Shaq stared at the drive for a beat, unsure whether to ask how the man knew what he was looking for or what might be on it. But the look in the janitor's eyes silenced every question. This was not a moment for curiosity. It was one for trust. Before Shaq could speak, the man had already picked up his mop again. "They don't think we see things," he said as he turned away. "But we always do." And then he was gone, swallowed by the terminal's machinery, fading into the choreography of carts and cones and clattering luggage. A ghost in plain sight. Shaq closed his fingers around the drive. It was cold, unassuming, but it carried weight. Later, in a quiet hotel room not far from the airport, Shaq sat on the edge of the bed, laptop open, curtains drawn. The only light came from the screen's glow as he inserted the drive and opened the only file inside, Whisper Protocol.mp4. The footage opened with no sound, just time-stamped clips from airport cameras, no narration, no context. Just scene after scene unfolding like bruises on clean skin. A black woman in business attire is pulled aside at a security checkpoint. Calm, compliant, she offers every document, but her name disappears from the boarding list as a staffer quietly types into a handheld device. She's told the flight is full, but the video shows 3 empty seats when the plane departs. Another scene. A Latino teen with a backpack being asked to step out of line. There's no alarm, no incident, yet his bag is taken, scanned, returned, and then he's told the gate is closed. He argues briefly, not aggressively, just confused. A white passenger behind him shrugs and boards without delay. Scene after scene unfolds. A pattern so specific, it can't be dismissed as coincidence. The timestamps jump between terminals. Different cities, same outcome. Black man, brown woman, Muslim couple, each pulled, each delayed, each quietly removed. No shouting, no arrests, just redirection. Like rerouting a package. The common thread wasn't danger, it was identity. And then came the documents. Scanned memos flashed briefly on screen. Internal forms marked with acronyms and flight codes. Words jumped out. VP. VPI flag, visual profile index, passenger risk behavior, level yellow, preemptive denial criteria, not to be disclosed. Shaq leaned forward, jaw tight. These weren't guidelines, they were protocols, and they were built to be unseen. One memo was especially damning. A circular dated 3 years ago, stamped internal only, detailing a pilot program titled Whisper. It described non-invasive preemptive passenger interruption techniques, language dressed in legality, but hollowed of humanity. It was a blueprint, a plan designed to control airport optics, to minimize incidents, to avoid confrontation. It looked like safety. It sounded like safety. But all it did was sideline those the system feared might become a problem, not because of behavior, but because of bias embedded in its bones. Shaq sat still as the footage shifted again, this time showing statistics, charts, trends. Over 72% of flagged passengers in the yellow watch tier over the last year were black or brown. Fewer than 2% had any escalation or refusal to comply. None, 0, had posed a verifiable threat. There was one final video clip. Devin Rucker. Same footage from earlier. But this time, extended. It showed the moment after the gate agent scanned his name, the subtle nod to a supervisor, the quiet cancellation on the screen, the deletion of his boarding access. The agent smiled as he told Devin there was a delay, but he wasn't delayed. He was discarded. Shaq clicked pause, sat back. His hands were clenched now, knuckles white against the laptop's dark frame. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was a pattern. It was sanctioned, systematized, and spread across airports with no visible fingerprints. It was designed to be quiet, because noise could be challenged. Noise required justification. Silence could be ignored. The janitor's words echoed back. They don't think we see things. But we always do. Shaq shut the laptop. His mind raced not with anger, but with precision. He wasn't going to tweet it. Wasn't going to call a press conference. Not yet. This was too big for outrage alone. This required exposure, carefully, deliberately. He pulled out his notebook, the one he rarely used, the one reserved for ideas he wanted to shape before sharing. He wrote one word on a blank page, whisper. Under it he began listing the names from the clips. Not full names, just initials, times, faces he could remember. Then Devin's name. Circled. He thought about how systems survive in silence. How people excuse them, justify them, ignore them. He thought about how often stories like this vanish because they don't explode. They dissolve. But not this one. This one had been handed to him in secret. By someone who had nothing to gain. A man with a mop and a memory. A witness hiding in plain sight. Shaq understood the burden now. The footage wasn't just data. It was a confession, one the system hoped no one would ever listen to. But he had, and he wouldn't be the only one. The cafe sat just outside the perimeter of the airport's security zone, in a nondescript building that looked more like an abandoned customs outpost than a functioning coffee shop. It was the kind of place nobody noticed unless they were trying to avoid being seen. Shaq parked in the corner lot and approached quietly, his frame cloaked in a hoodie, the morning sun hidden behind layers of drifting cloud. The place felt out of time. No music, no chatter, just the low hum of refrigeration units, and the rustle of newspapers nobody read anymore. Inside, seated in the back booth with his laptop half closed, and a coffee growing cold in front of him, was Langston Tay. Langston had always been a man of shadows. Once a stats geek from South Florida, he'd made his way into the back channels of aviation logistics. Not just the systems that moved people, but the ones that decided how they moved, who got flagged, what got noticed. He wasn't the face of change. He was the file nobody read, the whisper at the end of a hallway. And for the last 10 years, he'd kept his head down, until now. Shaq slid into the booth, nodding once. Appreciate you making time. Langston didn't smile, but the edge of his mouth shifted. For you, I got time. But I need to ask, are you ready for what you're poking at? Shaq rested his forearms on the table. I don't poke. Langston leaned back and exhaled slowly. All right then. From his coat pocket, Langston pulled out a slim folder. Not digital, not encrypted. Old school. Inside were photocopied memos, laminated charts, and a handwritten diagram of what he called the quiet code. Shaq opened it and began reading. The quiet code wasn't official, at least not in a way that could be quoted in public or cited in lawsuits. It was a parallel system, built by a group of mid-level policy architects, designed to help staff manage perceptions of safety in high-traffic airports. It worked in tiers, level 1 through 5, each corresponding not to behavior but to probability. Not probability of criminal intent, probability of guest discomfort, probability of interaction escalation. All metrics based on predictive modeling fed by historical data that conveniently ignored the biases baked into its creation. Langston pointed at one column. Level 3 is the catch-all. That's where most black and brown passengers land. Solo travelers. Business attire. Minimal interaction. They call it non-pattern behavior. Shaq frowned. So being calm is suspicious now. Langston nodded grimly. You'd be amazed how many profiles are flagged not because someone raised their voice, but because they didn't. Devon had fit it perfectly. Quiet, professional, alone, no check-in luggage, round trip booked through corporate accounts. Shaq had assumed it was random, but the reality was worse. It was designed. They call it checkpoints internally. Langston continued. Not the ones with scanners. These are soft checkpoints, coded moments built to slow down or reassess passengers who fit a certain trigger pattern. The term came from chess. You create small pauses, strategic delays. You don't need to block the king. Just slow the board. Shaq shook his head slowly. So they're not just monitoring us. They're playing us. Langston tapped a section labeled RFI. Reframe for interruption. This is the most dangerous part, he said. It tells staff how to casually intervene, like offering an unexpected seat reallocation, or saying the system timed out and they need to recheck documents. On paper, it all looks customer service friendly, but it's engineered obstruction. Shaq flipped to the last page of the diagram. There, highlighted in red, were 3 phrases. No record of delay. Passenger complied without incident. Case closed. It wasn't surveillance. It was orchestration. Langston rubbed the bridge of his nose, his voice low now. This system wasn't created to find threats. It was created to avoid blame. If something ever happens, a conflict, a lawsuit, they can point to these protocols and say they were just following the playbook no one knows exists. Shaq leaned back, heart pounding, not with rage, but a sharp-edged clarity. How long's this been going on? Langston stared at him. Long enough to bury 1,000 stories like Devon's. Outside the cafe window, a black SUV passed slowly. Not unusual, except it passed again 30 seconds later. Shaq clocked it without turning his head. Someone following you? Langston asked. Maybe not me, Shaq said. Maybe the truth. Langston's eyes darkened. I figured someone would be watching the moment I hit send on that email. You can't put this kind of documentation in play without a ripple. These people don't deal in explosions. They deal in quiet corrections. Make you late. Make you question your source. Make you tired enough to stop. Shaq looked up from the folder, but not scared enough to back down. Langston slid a thumb drive across the table. This has everything. Names. Internal emails. Passenger profiles tagged under quiet code. But you didn't get it from me. Shaq nodded. He wouldn't have to say a word about Langston. The data would speak loud enough. Langston stood to leave, pulling on his coat, but before turning, he paused. You want to know the worst part? Shaq waited. They built this code because of what might happen, but they never factored in what does happen. What this does to people, to how they move, how they stop showing up. That's what they don't measure. Disappearance. Shaq absorbed the words. Disappearance. That was it. Not erasure through violence or noise, but absence by design. You weren't removed, you were rerouted until you stopped returning. Langston was gone in seconds, swallowed by the early dusk. Shaq sat alone with the drive in his hand, the folder in his lap, and the cold certainty that what he'd stepped into was deeper than discrimination. It was choreography, it was strategy, it was built not just to maintain control, but to never be caught holding it. His phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. Still watching? So are we. Shaq stared at the message, then calmly shut his phone off. It was confirmation, not of danger, but of disruption. He'd kicked a fault line, and the tremors had already begun. But chess wasn't about noise. It was about timing, about recognizing the shape of a game before your opponent even knew you were playing. Checkpoints. They called it. Fine. Shaq knew how to move through those. Now it was time to reach checkmate. The hotel lobby was quiet, caught in the lull between morning checkouts and late arrivals. A faint hum from the ceiling vents filled the space, and somewhere nearby, the soft thud of a vacuum cleaner worked its way down the hall. Shaq stood at the edge of the elevator bay, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, waiting for the slow climb to the 10th floor. His reflection in the elevator's brushed metal doors looked calm, unreadable, but inside, something far heavier stirred. Devon Rucker had agreed to meet. No fanfare, no pretense, just a room number and a quiet understanding.
The ride-up was slow.
It gave Shaq too much time to think, to replay the footage, the files, the memo titles that sounded like legal riddles, wrapped in corporate policy. But what lingered most wasn't what he'd seen. It was what had been taken from Devon, not his flight, not his time, something deeper, something more personal. The loss of presence. The elevator doors opened with a chime. Shaq stepped out into a hallway lined with faded carpet and tired light fixtures. A kind of hallway where people left early, returned late, and spoke in hushed tones. Room 10101 team sat near the end, its door slightly ajar, as if waiting. Shaq didn't knock. He stepped in, gently pushing the door closed behind him, and found Devon sitting near the window in a high-backed chair, staring out into the pale morning light. The room was ordinary. A king bed, a desk with an unopened complimentary water bottle, beige walls with generic art, but it felt like a capsule, holding something raw and weighty within its thin frame. Devon didn't turn. He didn't need to. Shaq's presence filled the space, not with grandeur but gravity. He walked across the carpet slowly and took a seat opposite, a low armchair facing Devon, the distance between them more psychological than physical. For a while there was nothing but stillness, not silence, the kind of stillness where thoughts echo louder than words. Devon's posture was composed, but worn. Shoulders slightly rounded, legs crossed, fingers laced together in his lap. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, not really seeing the skyline, but traveling somewhere farther, somewhere quieter. Shaq took him in, absorbing the wear in his jawline, the faint tension around his eyes. This wasn't the face of a man defeated. It was the face of a man exhausted by staying whole in a world that constantly tried to chip away at him. There were no words exchanged, none needed. Instead, the room filled with the weight of everything unsaid, of the moments when people noticed, then looked away, of the times Devon had walked into spaces fully qualified, only to be met with suspicion shaped like smiles, of the polite deferrals, the non-answers, the rerouted opportunities that never made headlines, because they were engineered to feel like nothing at all. Shaq watched him and thought of all the metrics that had tried to reduce him: risk profiles, visual markers, travel frequency, clothing choices. Devon had become a target not because of who he was, but because of what he represented to an invisible algorithm, trained by invisible bias. And in that transformation, man to metric, his existence had been quietly rewritten. The room was still. Shaq's own thoughts were loud. He remembered the footage, the moment the boarding pass was voided, the slight nod from the agent, the absence of resistance from Devon. That haunted him more than anything else. Devon hadn't fought, because somewhere deep down, he'd learned that the fight was never with a person. It was with a wall you couldn't see, couldn't touch, but felt every time you stepped into a space that didn't know what to do with your presence. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees, and studied the floor between them. The carpet had a swirling design, probably meant to evoke clouds or waves, but it looked more like static. Noise. The kind you hear when you lose the signal, the kind that slowly drowns out the clarity of a voice. Devon was that voice. Clear, steady, but lost too often in the noise. He hadn't asked for this. He wasn't trying to make a point that day at the airport. He just wanted to fly, to speak at a conference, to share his ideas on machine learning, the future of ethical AI, the very tools that had, ironically, been used to predict him out of existence. Shaq thought about that irony. About the systems Devon had spent his career trying to improve, systems built on fairness, logic, optimization, being used to invalidate him. It wasn't just injustice, it was betrayal. And yet Devon hadn't responded with fury. He hadn't demanded a spotlight or staged a confrontation. He had sat quietly, absorbed a blow and walked away with his dignity intact, but bruised. Not the kind of bruise you see, the kind that lingers in the soul, the kind you carry alone. The air in the room thickened. Shaq's chest felt tight, not with anger, but with empathy. Because he knew that kind of tired. The kind that comes when your existence is questioned so subtly, so often, that you start adjusting yourself before the world even asks you to. He'd had moments in locker rooms, in sponsor meetings, in boardrooms where his height, his smile, his money weren't enough to offset the shadow others projected onto him. Devon finally moved. Not dramatically, just a small shift in his hands. He unfolded them and reached to the side table, picking up a folded piece of paper. He held it for a long moment, then placed it on the windowsill. Shaq's eyes tracked the gesture but didn't ask. It was a boarding pass, faded, crumpled, never scanned. Shaq understood immediately. It wasn't a keepsake. It was a tombstone. A marker for a moment that had buried something. He wondered how many other people had saved theirs. Proof of presence. Proof they were supposed to go. Proof they were stopped for reasons no one could say out loud. He looked at Devon again and thought, this is what erasure looks like. Not deletion, not removal, just absence. Just being moved enough times that you stop standing in certain spaces. Shaq felt the weight of everything on his shoulders now. Not just the files or the surveillance, or the patterns. It was the responsibility of holding someone else's silence and choosing what to do with it. Devon had told him, not with words but with presence, what mattered most. He didn't want revenge. He wanted return. He didn't want a spectacle. He wanted the right to exist without interruption. Shaq exhaled deeply and leaned back, letting the emotion settle. His mind catalogued every feeling, every moment, and then came the sentence, unspoken but thunderous. They didn't just cancel my flight. They canceled my presence. Shaq felt it echo inside his ribs, not just as Devon's truth, but as the truth of so many others. The sentence wasn't just about the airport. It was about every room Devon had entered and been half seen. Every panel he wasn't invited to. Every handshake that came with caution. Every nod that carried a question. Presence wasn't just physical. It was permission, and they had quietly revoked his. Shaq rose slowly, walking once to the window, then stopping beside Devon. He didn't speak. Instead, he looked out too, at the dull horizon, the city rising slowly beneath the overcast sky. Somewhere out there, planes were taking off. Seats were being filled. Voices were being heard. But in here, in this echo room of quiet pain and quiet resilience, something more powerful was happening. Shaq wasn't here to fix it. He was here to feel it, to carry it, to amplify what had almost been muted. Devon didn't turn, but Shaq knew he understood. Some rooms don't need sound. They just need someone who refuses to leave. The morning after the hotel room meeting with Devon, the city felt muted. The sky hung low, a dull slate gray, as if mirroring the weight of what Shaq now carried. The streets bustled below his penthouse suite, but they felt distant, like a different world altogether. He stood at the glass wall, coffee untouched in his hand, watching the skyline blur behind the breath of a world trying to hold itself together. His phone buzzed twice, then fell still. A text from Langston. No subject, no greeting, just 2 words. It dropped. Seconds later, an encrypted email arrived. Shaq sat down, opened his laptop, and waited for the secured file to load. It took a full minute, not because of the file's size, but because of the fire it carried. The title hit like a blunt object. Internal Policy Framework, Risk-Based Passenger Metrics, Confidential Use Only. It was the kind of document no one ever expected to read, not because it was hidden under lock and key, but because its existence was always denied with a practiced smile. It wasn't designed for public consumption. It was written in a language that dressed racism in legality, cloaking judgment as protocol and bias as preventative security. Shaq scrolled slowly. The document outlined a tiered framework. Passengers were rated across 4 risk levels, categorized not solely by behavior, but by a list of data points: travel history, ticket purchasing patterns, regional demographics, clothing choices, and what it called nonverbal cues associated with elevated unpredictability. The most damning section was flagged in red, or BP tier evaluation factors. Discretionary category: solo travelers with non-corporate digital footprints, infrequent flyers with cash purchase tickets, overcorrection in behavior, i.e. excessive politeness, quiet compliance, ambiguous ethnic markers paired with business attire, behavioral deviation from group norms during pre-boarding. Shaq's stomach tightened as he read the last note. Tier 3A, presence reassessment. Recommend indirect interruption. Gate agents permitted to use discretionary tools to delay, redirect, or reassess boarding eligibility, under passenger optimization discretion. Do not record specific rationale. This was Devon's erasure, broken down into bullet points. The memo wasn't vague. It was meticulous. It had diagrams, color-coded workflow charts, legal disclaimers, structured to pass audit scrutiny. The policy had been reviewed by 3 regional directors, one of whom had signed it using only their initials, W. Shaq leaned back, pulse steady but hard. This was more than evidence. It was blueprint and confession rolled into one. It wasn't a mistake. It was a machine, polished, tested, and passed through too many hands, that chose silence over conscience. He closed the laptop, letting the gravity of the moment settle over him. He knew what this meant. This document couldn't stay hidden, but revealing it wasn't going to be as simple as a tweet or a news drop. This wasn't just about exposing a system. It was about confronting the people who designed it, the ones who still believed in its efficiency. He opened his phone again, scanned through his contact list, and paused over a name, Talia Breen, an investigative producer, with a history of blowing up silent structures with nothing but truth and airtime. But this wasn't ready for her. Not yet. Not without knowing who WH was. Shaq dialed Langston. No, hello. Shaq spoke first. You sent this knowing it would burn the foundation. Langston's voice was low. Because it has to. But you're not the only one watching. And not all of them are passive. Shaq didn't ask for names. He just asked, who's WH? Langston paused, then said it. Wesley Hargrove, Deputy Chair of Operations Strategy. He authored the framework 3 years ago. He pushed it through when the FAA pushed back on hard profiling techniques. Whisper was his workaround. Shaq closed his eyes. He knew the name. Not personally, but he'd sat on panels with people like Hargrove. The kind who made injustice look like innovation. The kind who built walls behind clean presentations and diversity talking points. Langston continued. He's protected. Contracts, legal teams, influence in 3 major carriers. If you go at this wrong, it'll disappear, and you with it. Shaq didn't flinch. I'm not going at it wrong. He ended the call and stood up. In the reflection of the glass wall, he saw himself not as a celebrity, not as a retired athlete, but as a carrier of something heavier. The truth had a way of choosing unlikely messengers. But once it did, you didn't get to uncarry it. That afternoon, while waiting for a flight that would take him back to Atlanta, Shaq walked through the terminal with a different awareness. Every gate was a checkpoint now. Every glance between staff. Every smile laced with something else. He could feel it. Subtle shifts, lingering stares, the sudden appearance of a security agent who walked behind him for 3 gates, then peeled off without speaking. He was being watched. Not by fans. Not by passers-by. By the system itself. The one that tagged movement it couldn't predict. And Shaq, walking calmly with classified evidence in his bag, was now a disruption. He boarded the plane, sat in 1A, didn't speak, didn't post, just waited. And while the seatbelt signs dimmed overhead, he drafted what would become the first part of his reveal.
Not a video.
Not a press release. A story. It would begin not with the memo, but with the man. With Devon. With a presence cancelled, without explanation, with a pattern dressed as protocol. He would tell the story the way it deserved to be told, not as outrage, but as exposure. But even before the wheels lifted from the ground, his phone buzzed again. Blocked number. This time, a voicemail. He played it with headphones in. A man's voice. Calm, measured. We're aware of the material you've received. Consider who you put at risk when you step out of place. Some rooms were never meant for cameras. Click. Shaq didn't react. Didn't flinch. He stared ahead as the plane rose into the sky, because some stories don't stay in rooms. Some stories burn through glass, and he wasn't stepping out of place. He was stepping into it. The conference room on the 23rd floor of the downtown tower was filled with quiet tension. Morning light streamed through the wall-length windows, slicing the air with clarity that felt at odds with the conversation unfolding. The skyline of Atlanta loomed in the background, a city Shaq had long called home, where his name meant more than legacy, more than titles. Here he was something closer to legend. But today that legend was being tested. At the head of the polished walnut table, Shaq sat with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Around him sat his team, legal counsel, publicist, branding strategist, and financial advisor, each of them flipping through printed copies of the shadow memo, the folder Langston had warned would set off alarms, and it had. His publicist, a sharp-eyed woman, named Jocelyn, who'd helped him navigate the trickiest waters of fame, leaned in first. We're not questioning what's in here. Let's be clear about that. We believe you. But going public with this? It's not just heat, it's fire. Real, sustained, institutional fire. Next came Thomas, his legal advisor, conservative, meticulous, and always allergic to risk. The document is dangerous, Shaq. Not because it's fake, but because it's real. Too real. It implicates names, protocols, and systems that exist in federal gray zones. Once you break that seal, it's not just you in the line of fire, it's everyone connected to you. His financial advisor followed suit, voice calm but edged. You've got deals up for renewal. Brand partnerships, non-profit alliances, media contracts. This will become a political fight before it becomes a moral one. And we don't control how that plays out. The room fell quiet for a moment, not because the arguments were wrong, but because they were familiar, practical, logical, safe. Shaq stared down at the folder in front of him, his thumb brushing the corner of the paper like he was reading it for the first time. But he wasn't. He had memorized it, internalized it. He'd seen it play out not just in Devon's experience, but in every subtle erasure it described, every person quietly removed, every excuse wrapped in policy. He looked up slowly, his voice even. I didn't get here by playing safe. No one spoke. I didn't build this platform to sit on it. Not when I know what I've seen. Not when I've felt what I've felt. We don't get to call ourselves leaders if we walk around the wreckage and pretend we don't see the fire. Jocelyn exhaled and folded her arms. So what are you thinking? Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame anchoring the room. No press conference. No media circus. Just a story. My story. About Devon. About what I saw. What I now know. Not a speech. A message. For people. Told like it happened. The way I'd tell it if it was just me and someone who needed to hear the truth. He paused. If they want to come after me for telling a story that's real, let them. I've got broad shoulders. Thomas tapped his pen nervously. You understand. Once this is out, there's no rolling it back. Shaq nodded. That's the point. Later that evening, in his home studio, Shaq sat in front of a microphone. No lights, no cameras, just a voice recorder and a script he'd written by hand. It wasn't polished. It wasn't publicist approved. But it was precise. Every sentence was a stone placed carefully along the path he wanted people to walk. He began simply. I was at the airport. Not as a celebrity, just a man traveling. And I saw something that I can't unsee. The recording moved slowly, deliberately. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't embellish. He spoke like he was remembering in real time, pausing between sentences, letting the weight settle. I saw a black man, calm, suited, respectful, quietly removed from a flight. Not because of anything he did, but because of a system that had already decided who he might be. He described Devon's face. His silence. The vanishing. Then the footage. The janitor. The whisper program. The memo. But he didn't name names. Not yet. He named presence. They didn't just cancel his boarding pass. They canceled his presence. They treated him like a maybe. And that's how it happens. Not with chains or cuffs, but with policy dressed like protocol. The story ran 22 minutes. No music. No intro. Just Shaq. A man telling the truth he could no longer hold quietly. When he finished, he uploaded it anonymously to a private link. Then sent it to 4 people. 1. Dev. 2. Langston. 3. Talia Breen, the journalist. 4. A small civil rights nonprofit who'd once invited Shaq to a roundtable on digital discrimination. A group that had never once asked for a donation or a tweet. Just present. The link went live at 11. By 6:00 a.m., it had been downloaded 5,000 times. By 8:15 it was trending on Reddit. Not under celebrity gossip, but under erased while boarding. A tag that carried quiet fury. Devon messaged one sentence. I never thought my silence would speak. Langston replied with a thumbs-up emoji and one word. Checkmate. But not everyone was pleased. At 9:03 a.m., Jocelyn called. Her voice was taut. Hargrove's team sent a statement to the media. They're denying the memo, accusing the audio of being fabricated. They're calling it a malicious conspiracy, rooted in misinformation. Shaq stayed calm. Did they deny the protocol exists? No, just the leak. That was enough. By noon, journalists were calling for interviews. Shaq declined them all. He didn't need a media tour. The message was already moving. At 2:21 p.m., a former airline employee anonymously posted screenshots of internal communications validating elements of the whisper tiering system. The dam had started to crack, but what mattered more than the noise was the echo. Messages flooded in. Not to Shaq's public account, but to the inbox tied to the audio's anonymous release. Stories. Dozens. Hundreds. People who had been Devon, or had seen a Devon, or had once stayed silent next to a Devon, and were now speaking because someone finally had. Shaq didn't respond. He read. He listened. At 5:17 p.m., a call came in from an unknown number. He answered. No voice. Just a click. Then silence. A message in its own right. A reminder that speaking up would always trigger shadows. But Shaq didn't flinch. He stood again at his window, Atlanta glowing beneath the setting sun. The airspace between right and easy had never been wider, but he was already walking through it. And this time, he wasn't walking alone. This is gate 27, Shaq said, turning the camera back on himself. Couple weeks ago I sat right over there. He pointed, and watched a man named Devin Rucker lose his right to be seen. Not loud, not dramatic, just gone. Quietly removed. His boarding pass was cancelled. His name disappeared from the manifest. No explanation. The view count began to climb. A few hundred, then 1,000, then 10. I've talked to folks since then. Seen footage, read documents. There's a whole structure built around who gets to move and who doesn't. And it's not based on threat. It's based on fear dressed up like policy. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke like a man delivering gospel, a truth passed down in code and lived experience. His tone was measured, slow, each word chosen, not for impact, but for precision. They call it risk-based metrics, he continued. But it's not about risk. It's about race, about assumptions, about pattern recognition that's really just generational bias in a tech suit. The comments flooded in. Blue hearts, fire emojis, a wave of "we see you, thank you," and say his name, Devin Rucker. I'm standing here because this gate, this specific space, turned a man into a ghost. But I'm also standing here because I refuse to let silence win. They canceled his presence, not because of who he was, but because of what they thought he might be. And that's not security, that's suppression. His voice tightened, just slightly. I've been in a lot of rooms, MBA courts, business tables, charity galas. But none of those rooms matter if I don't show up in this one, where systems make people disappear behind terms like optimization and disruption prevention. The stream's numbers crossed 60,000. Media outlets were picking it up in real time, embedding the feed on their homepages. Clips were already being ripped and posted. The algorithm had no choice but to obey. Shaq turned the camera toward the airline counter. This system, this terminal, is designed to make what happened here look normal. Routine. But routine injustice is still injustice. A woman behind him, early 30s, stopped and listened. Another man, headphones in, paused and pulled out his phone. The space around Shaq began to shift, not because of noise, but because of weight. People were starting to feel what the place had forgotten. He ended the stream with a sentence that didn't shout. It whispered with power. We don't need more noise. We need more witnesses. Be one. He tapped the screen. The live feed ended. The video saved. Within 20 minutes it had been reposted across every major platform. News anchors debated it. Columnists praised it. Critics tried to water it down. But the story was too precise, too lived in. It didn't need a headline. It already had a heartbeat. At 4:43 p.m., the airport board issued a press release. We take these allegations seriously. We are launching an internal review to evaluate our security protocols and passenger handling procedures. It was worded perfectly. Empty, polite, defensive under the veil of progress. But beneath the press release was a name. Wesley Hargrove, the deputy chair, the architect of the Whisper Protocol. The same man Langston had warned about. What the public didn't know, what Shaq was just about to learn, was that Hargrove wasn't backing down. Not quietly, not at all. That evening, Shaq received a sealed letter at his office. No sender, no label. Inside was a single sentence, typed in 12-point Times New Roman. You've disrupted the gate, but the runway is still ours. Shaq read it once, then again. He understood. This wasn't just about airport gates. This was about infrastructure, about layers deeper than terminals and surveillance, about boardrooms, data centers, contracts signed in language no one outside those rooms could ever decode. But now the language was exposed, and the public wasn't just watching, they were listening. That night, someone posted a second leak, not from Langston, from a different whistleblower. A full directory of flagged passengers, dates, timestamps, profiles. Devin's name was there. So was the name of a young woman, who had filed a civil complaint 2 years ago, and was told it was a misunderstanding. Shaq sat in his office, hands steepled, staring at the screen as the names rolled by. The dominoes had started falling. Gate 27 was no longer just a gate. It had become a broadcast tower, and the signal couldn't be stopped now. The fallout came quietly at first, a ripple beneath the surface of the airport's gleaming structure. Passengers began asking more questions. Internal email chains spread faster than official memos. The whisper protocol, once confined to the shadows of back offices and closed-door boardrooms, now floated across news cycles and employee lounges. At Gate 27, where silence had once been weaponized, people spoke louder, not just in anger, in reflection, in reckoning. 3 staff members involved in the incident with Devon Rucker were reassigned within 72 hours. It wasn't dramatic. No cameras, no press conferences, no admission of guilt, just a quiet reshuffling with phrases like pending review and placed on alternate duty used to cushion the truth. But beneath the soft language, something had cracked. One of them didn't disappear into that shuffle. His name was Grant Willis. Tall, mid-40s with a worn-out look that suggested both discipline and fatigue. Grant had worked the airport circuit for 18 years. Most of that time had been spent as a mid-tier gate operations supervisor. Respected by some, forgettable to most. He was the one who had scanned Devon's boarding pass that day. The one who, after receiving the prompt on his handheld device, had tapped a single key. Void. One click. One man. Gone. For days after the broadcast, Grant had tried to push the moment from his mind. He told himself what they all told themselves. It wasn't personal. It was procedure. It was protocol. But the lie refused to hold. Because he remembered Devon's face. Not angry. Not loud. Just confused. And then resolved. Like someone who'd been here before. And Grant knew that look too well. He'd worn it once. 20 years ago. A memory he'd buried deep. He'd been 23. A college dropout on his way to interview for a job at a distribution center out west. Dressed clean. Alone. Nervous. He was stopped at the airport in Tulsa. A red flag on his name, they'd said. Something about a similar profile. They delayed him for 4 hours. He missed his interview. Slept overnight in the terminal. No one apologized. Back then he hadn't asked why. Just like Devon didn't. He remembered walking out of that airport, silent and humiliated, thinking, next time, I'll make sure I'm invisible. That's how he got into airport work. Not because it was his dream, but because it gave him control. Or at least the illusion of it. But control, he would learn, didn't mean freedom. It meant complicity. The moment that crushed him didn't come from a headline or an online thread. It came in the form of a comment from his teenage daughter. They were watching the clip of Shaq's broadcast at Gate 27. She'd seen it before he did. Shared on her social feed, replayed with captions. He'd hoped she wouldn't make the connection. But she turned to him, her voice quiet. Weren't you working that gate? He didn't answer. Didn't lie. Didn't nod. She waited. Then said, you didn't say anything. You just let it happen. That broke something inside him. Because she wasn't accusing. She was disappointed. And somehow that was worse. He didn't sleep that night, or the night after. He watched Devon's face in his mind, replayed the moment when the boarding pass blinked red. He saw his own hand hit the key, mechanical, detached. And then he saw himself 23, delayed, erased. He wasn't just part of the system. He was proof of its cycle. A few days later, Grant called a friend who worked in operations compliance, asked if there was any process for submitting a formal statement. Not an appeal, not a defense, a confession. He wrote it in one sitting. No edits, no lawyers, just truth. I was the gate supervisor when Devon Rucker was removed. I followed the prompt I was given by our internal system. I voided his boarding pass. I did not ask questions. I did not challenge the order. I told myself I was following protocol. But I saw him. I knew it was wrong. And I still hit the button. This wasn't the first time I followed a prompt like that. It's happened before. Quietly, some passengers get rerouted. Others just disappear from the manifest. We say it's security. We say it's behavioral flagging. But the truth is, we don't ask who programs the flag. We just follow it.
I was profiled once, years ago, and I swore I'd never let anyone feel the way I did. And then I became the one pressing the key.
I'm sorry. Not just to Devon, but to every name that never made the list. I can't undo what I've done. but I can stop lying about why I did it. He didn't expect it to go public. He submitted it through the internal ethics portal. But someone inside leaked it. Maybe someone who needed to hear someone else break first. It landed online with little context. No headline, just a scan of the statement. Signed Grant Willis, former ops supervisor, Terminal B. And it lit up like fire. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. An admission. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Just one man saying, I followed orders. I was wrong. And I knew. The public response was electric. Some called him a coward. Others brave. But most were silent. Because it forced something uncomfortable to the surface. What if the villains aren't always monsters? What if they're just people? Tired, conditioned, told not to question. Shaq read the statement twice. Then he did something he hadn't done yet. He reached out to Grant. No cameras, no platforms, just an invitation to meet. They sat together a week later, in a neutral space, a public garden behind the city's aviation museum. Shaq didn't judge. He just listened. Grant spoke slowly, without defensiveness, without excuses. He explained how the prompts worked, how sometimes they came with codes, sometimes they came with no explanation at all. He said the hardest part wasn't pressing the button. It was how easy it had become. Shaq asked him one question. What made you change? Grant stared out at the water fountain nearby, then answered. It wasn't seeing the video. It was realizing my daughter had. And that was the heart of it. Not policy. Not protocol, but legacy. Grant had become what once hurt him, and it took a quiet voice at home to wake him up. Shaq left the meeting with no need to post or explain. The truth had already spoken. Later that night, Devon messaged Shaq for the first time since the broadcast. Just one line. I saw what he wrote. I believe him. Not forgiveness. Not closure. But something heavier, or recognition. That not every villain is evil. Some are just lost. And some just maybe can find their way back. At the exit, Shaq finally pulled out his phone. He opened Devon's message thread. Nothing had been said since the day Grant's confession went public. He typed one line. You good? A moment passed. Then came the reply. More than good. I'm finally moving. Shaq smiled faintly, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and walked out into the morning light. No cameras followed. No fans chased. The world kept turning. And behind him, somewhere high above, a flight headed west carried a man who once vanished.
Not anymore.
Today, Devon boarded first, because sometimes the loudest stories are told without raising a voice. Shaq crossed the curb outside the terminal, hoodie still pulled up, eyes calm. And his phone? Still off. This isn't just a story. It's a mirror. If it made you pause, made you think, made you feel, don't let that fade. Share the silence you saw, the truth you now carry. Because the next Devon might not have a Shaq watching. And the system only changes when we stop moving past what moves us.